Hello and welcome to the post-production part of this tutorial series. Today we're going to learn how to take this final rendering, which we rendered in the previous tutorial, and take it into Photoshop and make a more realistic image out of this. More realistic, more vibrant, and better. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to save this image here on the hard drive. In order to do this, we have the what we did in the previous tutorial. We applied render elements to this image. So lighting, specular, reflection, and global illumination. All these elements are present in this drop-down menu. You have the global illumination, reflection, specular, and lighting. Each one of this is essentially a layer, a different layer of the same image. So in order to save all these layers in separate files, what I need to do is hit and hold this disk icon until this drop-down menu appears. Here I'm going to select Save All Image Channels to Separate Files, which means every file will have a different channel from this list. So we have the color channel, which is the image itself. We have the global illumination, lighting, reflection, and specular. All the channels we applied in the previous tutorial. Alright, so after saving using these two diskettes icon, we will save it wherever we want. We will go into Photoshop in order to begin our post-production. So the first thing, I'm assuming that you have a basic knowledge of Photoshop. If not, there are a lot of good tutorials on the subject on the internet. I might make a few tutorials on the subject myself. But for now, I'm assuming you have a basic knowledge of this software. So I'm going to open all these channels we created in 3D Studio Max. Now we have all the channels open. And on this side you have all the layers that we'll put on top of each other. So we'll start with the color, which is the image itself. I'm going to magnify it so it fits the screen. And now I'm going to right click on the background layer and duplicate it. Let's call it background soft. The reason I'm going to call it soft is because I'm going to multiply these layers on top of one another by using a soft light method. So this will create a bit of contrast. Now this is way too much contrast, so I'm going to give it a soft value of the opacity will be something like, let's start with 30. When I click on the eye icon, it disables this layer here, so I can see how it was before and how it is now. So a value of 30 is fine. Next thing I'm going to apply in the layer menu here is the global illumination layer. So I'm going to take this, one second, I'm going to take this global illumination layer and I'm going to select the whole layer, hit Ctrl C for copy, and go back to our main image and create a new layer here and Ctrl V in order to paste. So this is the global illumination layer. I'm going to double click and call it GI, again soft, because I'm going to use the soft method to bind them together. And I'm going to right click, duplicate, and create a GI screen. Now I'm going to Control select both of them and put them in a group. So I'm going to call this group GI because this is the global illumination group. Let's open this group up. We can see we have the GI soft and the GI screen. The soft will create a little bit more contrast. Let's close this layer up for a second and focus on this one. So this GI soft, I'm going to use a blend method of soft light. And again, this is way too much contrast, so I'm going to make it the opacity of it something like 20. And the screen layer, I'm going to use a method of screen in order to multiply them. This will make the image much brighter, so I'm going to use an opacity of something like 30 here too. As a rule, I'm using values of opacity for all my layers between 20 to 30. Maybe in some instances a little bit more, like 35, or a little bit less, like 15. But as a rule, it's between 20 to 30, depending on how the image looks in my eyes. So I'm going to use maybe a little bit more, 35, because I want the brightness, even 40. And the GI Soft gives it a little bit of contrast. Let's give it 25. And this one is 30. So this is fine. Next thing I want to do is I'm going to add a lighting layer, which will give these bright areas more light, and the dark areas will remain the same. So we'll have more light in the scene. The light areas will be brighter, more vibrant. So when I take this image and drag it here, it will place it not in place. It will place it somewhere, but it needs to be exactly in the same place as the images below. So Control Z to deselect this. I'm going to delete it for a second using the delete key. In order to place it exactly in the same spot as the layers below, what you do is you hold Shift and then drag this layer here. This will place it exactly in the same spot. So holding Shift and dragging here. Alright, I'm going to close this image. Now we have a new layer on top of the other layers. Let's call it lighting. And I'm going to give it a blend value of screen. The screen value usually uses the brighter areas and makes them brighter. So I'm going to use screen for our lighting. If I disable this, you can see the difference. The brighter areas become more bright than they were before. So I'm going to use a value of something like 40 here, maybe even a little bit more, 50. And as you can see, if I click on history, I can take it back to the beginning. It looked like this, and now it looks like this. So you have a difference. You have brighter values in the brighter areas, and you have more contrast. The image starts to look much better. So this is the lighting multiplier. 50 is fine. Next one I'm going to do is the reflections. So these are all the reflection I have in my image. I'm going to again drag this here and shift drag this image into my main image. And let's close this up. Now we have a new layer with the reflections. So let's call it reflection. 1 second. Reflections. And I'm going to give it a blend value of screen again, because I want the brighter areas of our reflections to become brighter in the image. So I'm going to use screen. Now if I disable this, you can see the difference. The reflective areas in my image become much brighter. So this is a value of opacity 100. This is way too much. I'm going to give it a value of 40. I'm sorry. This will give the reflections a nice glow feeling, which is very good for us. So this is for the reflection. The specular is like the reflection, but for metal objects and things like glossy wood. So this will add a little bit of shininess to the image. So I'm going to take this here and again shift drag to the main image. And let's close this up. Let's call it specular, and let's give it a value again of screen. Now if I disable this, you can see the difference. The wood is brighter. You can see shininess on the metal here, but the value of 100 is too much. Let's give it something like 70. And the global illumination we already used, so I'm going to close it. So now you have this image here with all these layers. So we have in this directory the global illumination, and we essentially used all the layers that we exported in 3D Studio Max. If we go in history, let's open this up a little bit. In history to the beginning, it looked like this. now it looks like this. So much more vibrant, the grass looks better, and essentially the image looks better. The next thing I want to do is give it more contrast. In order to do this, I'm going to use the curves modifier here. So this will add, when I use the curves, I click here, these are the modifiers in Photoshop. So when I click here, I can choose which modifier I want to add. You have modifiers like brightness, curves, levels, and more. So for this example, I'm going to use curves, and you can use manually, just make it brighter here and add contrast in the darker areas. It creates something like an S. This is essentially contrast. But I don't want to use the manual contrast because there is a very good preset that I usually use, which is the linear contrast. It adds just a little bit of contrast. So I'm going to use this one. If I disable this, you can see the image is a bit more contrasted, which is good for us. So I'm going to use this curve modifier. Next modifier that I'm going to add is the levels modifier. This is a very, very good modifier that I use often, which gives me a brightness to the image and enhances the contrast. So the upper value here, the 255, when you take it down, the image will become brighter. So I can take it down and the image becomes burned. So I'm going to give it a value of not so low, something like 245. Let's start here. If I close this, you can see the difference, just a little bit brighter. And this value down here, the darker areas, when I take it up or give it a bigger value than 0, the darker areas will become darker. So if you take this value down and this value up, this one up and this one down, the image becomes more contrasted. Because what contrast is the difference between the bright areas in the image to the dark areas in the image. So if I give it a value of something like 15, you can see that the darker areas become much too dark. So I'm going to use a smaller value like 5. Now if I disable this, you can see the difference. You have just a bit more brightness. Now I want to make this image brighter and a little bit less contrasted. So I'm going to, when this value in the middle here, when you take it up, the image becomes more contrasted and darker, and down becomes less contrasted and brighter. So 1 is the normal value here. So I'm going to give it a value of something like 0.98. Sorry, like this. So the difference here is just a little bit brighter in the sky area. But you know what? I don't think I'm going to touch this. Let's leave it at 1. Let's make this smaller than 5 because it's a little bit too dark, like 3. And this one, let's make it brighter. 235. Maybe 240. Like so. Okay. Next step I'm going to do is I'm going to add another modifier here from this stack here. The modifier that I'm going to add is saturation. When you add contrast to the image, it naturally becomes more vibrant, so the colors become more colorful. But a true image, a true photograph, is never that colorful. It's just a little bit less colorful than this. So I need to take the saturation value down. So let's give it a -15 for a more realistic look. If I turn this off, you can see it's just a bit less burnt with colors, because it's very, very bright green. So I need to add this, but 15 is too much. Let's make it -10 maybe, something like this. Next modifier I want to add is brightness. I want to make the image just slightly more bright, so let's make it 10 or maybe even more, 15. No, less, 10 is fine. Now let's go to history for a second. I want to see the difference between the beginning and what we are at now. So if I go to the beginning, this is the image we exported from 3D Studio Max. Now after all the layers that we added, this is the image that we have now. So we improved the contrast and we improved the brightness and the grass, and all without using these tools here, only by using the layers and the methods of combining the layers with each other. The screen method and the soft light method. Soft light for contrast, screen for brightness. So this is fine for now. Let's make this a little bit. Okay, so this is the history panel. You can go back levels, back steps that you created. And this level here is properties. These are the properties of these modifiers here. So you have the curves that we created. You can modify it here manually. You can modify the levels, make it brighter or more contrasted. Let's make it just a bit more contrasted. And a bit less bright, 245 is fine. You have the saturation value here that you can take up and down, and you have the brightness value. So the last thing I want to do is I want to color correct this image just a bit. So I'm going to add a modifier named color balance on top of all the other things. And I'm going to balance the colors here. You have the blue sky that shines on the building itself. So the bright areas need to be a little bit more bluish. So I'm going to go to the highlights, which are the bright areas of the image, and I'm going to add just a bit of blue. So something like 5 and -5 here, like so. So if I disable this, you can see just a bit of a blue tint from the sky falling down on the building. Now in the darker areas you might have a different color, so I'm going to go to the shadows, and in the shadows I want to add just a little bit of yellow, so I'm going to make it a value like -5 here, and a little bit of red for the yellow, so it's like the sun here, so a little bit of red. No, that's no red, the red is not good. Let's add just a little bit of green from the grass in the shadows here, so like 2 maybe. Small values, maybe 2 here also. And in the midtones, let's add just a little bit of yellow from the sun, so -3. Alright, so now let's see all the changes that we made using the color balance in the midtones, shadow areas in the image, and the highlights areas of the image. This is before, this is after. It's a very, very delicate change, but if you see this area here and the sky, you can see the difference when I click it. Just a bit less red and more lively and blue from the sky. So this is our final image for now. Next thing I want to do, I want to make it sharper. We're finished with all these layers here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on the top layer, and I'm going to click on flatten image. This will flatten all the layers back to one basic layer. And now what I want to do is add a filter, a sharpen filter. This will sharpen the image a bit. So I'm going to go to filter, sharpen, unsharpen mask, and I'm going to write the amount of sharpness here. If you look at the image now, if I give it a crazy amount like 500, you can see the image is way too sharp. It's posterized. So what I want to do is not give it that high of a value. Let's give it a value of like 60 maybe. So if I unclick preview, you can see the difference in this area, for instance. Let's go in this area here. So if I go preview, you can see it's a bit more sharp. Let's hit OK. Let's zoom in for a second. Not that much. Alt to zoom out. Hold Alt and click on zoom out. And if I click on history and I go back before I sharpen the image, you can see the difference. Sharpness adds a little bit of something. Okay, fit to screen. So this is our image here. So the first image was this one. This is how we got the image from from 3D Studio Max, and after all we did in this tutorial, this is the final image for us. So it looks much more realistic. The sky is shining blue on the building, and all the changes that we made real difference. So the post-production of a 3D image is a very important step. This is the last step, and it's what bumps the image up a few levels. So thank you for watching this tutorial series, and the next tutorial series will be up soon. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching, and I see you in the next tutorial.